Welcome. I'm Neil Chase, the CEO at CalMatters. If you're new to us, we're a nonprofit newsroom with 35 journalists covering the issues that are most important to Californians, issues like education, healthcare, the environment, and how our state comes back from this pandemic. And I can't think of a more important conversation to have right now than the one we're going to have today about our children. So I appreciate you being here. If you find the session useful, I hope you'll follow our work, visit calmatters.org, sign up for our free daily newsletter. And if you're in a position to help, consider making a donation, what you can, to support the important work of our nonprofit newsroom. I also want to especially thank First 5 LA, our partners who are making this event possible and supporting us today with the support not just for this event, but for the entire package that we're doing on healthcare for children. The host today is Jocelyn Weiner. Jocelyn writes about health issues for us and has a special expertise in covering mental health. She's a native Californian who's covered health, poverty, and homelessness issues here in California and around the world. We already have some of the questions you submitted, but it's not too late. Put your question in the chat during the session. You can ask it on Facebook or YouTube with a hashtag for this event, Back to School CA, and Jocelyn will get in as many of your questions as she can. And with that, Jocelyn, it's all yours.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you to everyone joining us virtually this morning. It's been a tough year for all of us. For our kids, in many ways, it's been especially challenging. Their schools closed suddenly. Their parents are now 5 months into juggling childcare and education while facing additional stresses from work to unemployment, cramped living situations, the prospect of eviction, or the virus itself. Some kids have lost people they love. Many have been separated from beloved relatives, friends, and teachers. Perhaps they're missing a trusted school counselor or their soccer teammates or their neighborhood park. On top of all of that, right now, half the state seems to be on fire. We know that calls to suicide hotlines are up and Californians are reporting higher levels of anxiety. It's no surprise that the stress adults are experiencing is also impacting children. Now that school is starting up again virtually, parents and teachers are concerned about children's mental health and the long-term impacts of these experiences. As we move forward in this culture of distancing and family bubbles, how are our kids doing? What will this unprecedented time mean for their health, their education, and their lives going forward? How can we make it better for them? I have a kindergartner and a third grader myself, so I will tell you that I am as personally invested as all of you in our panelists' insights. As Neil mentioned, we're going to do our best to get to as many of your questions as we can, so please submit them on the platform you are watching this on with the hashtag #BackToSchoolCA. Last month, I moderated another conversation about mental health policy in the pandemic, and earlier in the spring, I moderated a panel on ways people can address their own mental health needs and those of their family members. For those looking for more information along those lines, I encourage you to check out recordings of those excellent conversations on our YouTube channel or on our podcast page, soundcloud.com/CalMatters. With that, I'm excited to have these three speakers here to help us make sense of this moment. Joining us is Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who is Surgeon General of California and who has focused on addressing the long-term trauma of adverse childhood experiences and is working to incorporate solutions and support across the state. Dr. Sergio Aguilar-Gaxiola, who is director of the UC Davis Center for Reducing Health Disparities and who focuses on pediatric onset of mental illness. And Patricia Lozano, executive director of Early Edge California, a Los Angeles-based policy and advocacy organization that focuses on early learning for children, especially those from low-income families. Panelists, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to ask one opening question of all of you and then a few of my own questions. Then we'll hear from the audience. I want this to be a conversation, so all of you should feel free to jump in on any question if you have something to add. The opening question. It has now been nearly 6 months since the pandemic began and children started learning from home. Beyond their schooling being disrupted, many children have also seen their home lives change if their parents lost jobs, faced financial difficulties, or dealt with medical issues. How do you think children have been impacted by these shifts? Dr. Burke-Harris, do you want to go first or?
I'm happy to. Thank you for the question. So, I think that what we see is that across families, households, neighborhoods, there has been an incredible amount of stress related to the pandemic and all the changes and all the uncertainty. And I think that as we know, different children respond differently. So for some kids, that level of stress is tolerable, and they, make sense of it and make meaning of it with the support of their caregivers. But for some kids, we recognize that the level of that stress really rises to trauma. The impact that it has on them is frankly traumatic. And we recognize for those kids, right, that they need extra support, extra care, both from their caregivers and, if necessary, from a health or a mental health provider. And that can manifest in lots of different ways. It can from behavior and mood, all the way to headaches and tummy aches, difficulty sleeping, changes in appetite. So it really depends on the age, the developmental stage, and then also, of course, the protective factors and each child's individual sensitivity and vulnerability.
Great, thank you. Dr. Aguilar Gaxiola, do you have some thoughts?
Yes, I thank you for the question as well. And I totally agree with Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. The pandemic has introduced unique mental health risks for children, especially very young children. One of the reasons is that many children may not have reached the stage in their development where they have the coping skills to navigate a transition that has been so sustained and radical as this one. For example, with schools closed, children may be exercising less, struggling to have their nutritional needs met, and also they may be experiencing irregular sleep patterns. And children also may be also living with significant psychosocial stressors. Some of them were mentioned by Dr. Burke-Harris, like, for example, fear of being infected or their parents being infected, in addition to the sadness of not being around friends and teachers. Unfortunately, something that we need to keep in mind as well is that there is a higher risk for domestic violence and child abuse during these times, as many parents experience job losses and financial stress, which often leads to feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, demoralization. And we need to think about not only the pandemic crisis, there is also an unemployment crisis and housing crisis. And what we are in my opinion, to see more in a more present manner is a mental health crisis.
Thank you. Patricia, what are you seeing?
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, I think, I agree with both Dr. Harris and Aguilar. I do worry a lot for little kids because this is putting them in a situation that is totally against nature. So basically, they're born to be social, to play, to be outside, to be in really close contact with other humans. So I worry about how this is affecting the way they're, seeing the world now, and the fear of contact with others. And even if they have the opportunity to go to a learning setting, they cannot hug their teachers, they cannot hug their friends, right? So I think we don't know how this will impact them, but we really need to think about, once this is over, how are we going to come back and help them adapt, right? Again, and say, it is like relearn all about being, making friends and being social and playing and sharing, which now we're telling them you can't do that. And that's how little kids learn. So I think for me, I'm really thinking yes now, and it is really difficult for parents and kids, but also what are we thinking for after? how do we prepare the caregivers and parents to help them come back to the normal, our normal. So yes.
Thank you so much. Well, you all raised a lot of points that I think we will definitely want to follow up on. For now, I wanted to target just a couple of the questions, and then I'm going to open it up more to the listeners. So, Surgeon General, I want to start with a specific question for you. You have really brought a spotlight to ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Can you explain ACEs for those who aren't familiar and talk to us about your concerns about this particular moment for kids?
Sure. So adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, refer to stressful or potentially traumatic experiences that happen during childhood. When scientists like me talk about ACEs, we talk about specific categories of experiences that were researched in a very large study that was done by the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente, called the ACE study, that was done over 20 years ago. And what they found was that when individuals are exposed to adverse childhood experiences, and the ones they specifically researched were physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, or growing up in a household with parental mental illness, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, domestic violence, that these, the more of these an individual experience, the greater their risk, not just for some of the things that we would intuitively expect with childhood adversity, things like mental health concerns like depression and anxiety, or risk of suicide, or things like substance use, but also things like heart disease and chronic lung disease and liver and kidney disease. Because it turns out that when we experience something stressful or scary, it activates our body's stress response that releases stress hormones. And if that happens in a limited amount, that's healthy, it's protective. But if it happens too frequently, too often, or too severely, then those stress hormones can go from being life-saving to health damaging. And so now what we know about adverse childhood experiences is that the more adversity or trauma an individual has experienced, the greater the risk to their health. But what we also know is that safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments are protective. And so that is one of the big things that we learned. And I think that it is really relevant right now to the pandemic, that so many of us are experiencing such high levels of stress. And at the same time, especially for kids, as we hear, there are, right now during the pandemic, we believe that children are experiencing more ACEs, that it's really important for us to be making those connections, making sure that we have those relationships, even if they are a little bit more remote, or a grandparent, connecting with a grandparent through story time or something like that. Maintaining those social connections is really important for having those buffering protective factors.
Great, thank you. Dr. Aguilar-Gaxiola, given your research on children's mental health, and particularly on the onset of mental illness, do you think more children might be diagnosed in the future, and why?
Yes, and my answer is going to be to complement the excellent response that Dr. Burke-Harris gave. I had been involved in international research with the World Health Organization sponsored study or ongoing initiative that we call the World Mental Health Survey. Is an initiative that brings together nearly 40 countries. And one of the things that we reported several years ago is that experiencing the adverse childhood events that Dr. Burke Harris mentioned is the strongest predictor of early onset mental illness. And in addition to that, that is going to predict, premature aging and physical conditions. So experiencing adversity early in life, we know that has a direct effect on a person's mental and physical health as they grow. And certain kinds of trauma, like the ones that Dr. Burke Harris mentioned, can affect the pace of aging. And this is according to a new Harvard research that showed that in addition to being risk factors for anxiety, depression, and stress, early life experiences like poverty, neglect, and violence are powerful predictors of physical health outcomes like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, and even mortality. Kids can die from that. And something that I want to emphasize, which is fascinating in this remarkable study that was recently published, actually, is a systemic review of the literature and a meta-analysis, which reviews several articles on the topic. What they reported is that they investigated actually 2 different forms of childhood adversity and their connection to alterations in the pace of biological aging, including the onset of poverty and other physical changes. And what they found is fascinating. It is that they reported that violent or traumatic experiences led to accelerations in pubertal development, brain development, and cellular aging, while neglect and chronic poverty did not, although they can affect physical and cognitive development in other ways. So it is now we have more specific data on different types of experiences. For example, violent or traumatic experiences versus poverty, for example. And they appear to have differential impacts, not only on mental health, but physical health as well. And so the finding is remarkable that children who experience violence reach poverty at an earlier age than those who did not. But this was not true, as I mentioned, for children exposed to deprivation or poverty.
Okay, thank you. Patricia, you work directly with childcare centers and parents. What are you hearing from the people you serve about how kids are doing and what their concerns are, especially for low-income families with kids who might also be dealing with other difficulties like job losses or housing instability?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So first, you have to think about the childcare providers, how they're dealing with a lot of stress, right? There are heroes now open to serve, essential workers and others that need care. As you know, childcare, it's essential. And I feel like they've been doing such a great job and we need to support them. I feel like they're trying to figure out how to do this new, type of learning and supporting families that are going through a lot. So what we hear is that both, they're trying to provide mental health support to parents, mental health support to kids that are in their care that are going through a lot. And also, they need also to take care of themselves. We hear that, they're very worried about kids, obviously in poverty, especially those who don't speak English, because as language is, if you don't speak the language, there's even one more barrier to during this time, distance learning for kids who don't speak English. It's really hard because how do you communicate? At least if you go to a center, there's some kind of interaction there. So they're very worried of how to, reach to these kids, and then the effects of, we know that, Latino families are being really affected by the crisis. So they are going through a lot already with their families, and they're being isolated too, because if there's no way to connect with the teacher because she doesn't speak the language, we don't know. So they're very worried. And I know, all the teachers are doing and providers are doing their best to connect with families, but they need more resources. And I think they're trying to figure it out as we are all doing it, right? Is like, how do we really provide emotional support to kids when you cannot do it physically, when you have to wear a mask and they cannot connect, and we know in early childhood that's so important, that interaction between the caregiver and the child. And here is like, you have to keep a distance. So any opportunities to provide that warmth at a center, if they are attending, it's very limited, right? So I think that I think what we think we should do is provide as many tools as possible to caregivers right now, and on ways to connect with families, on ways to inform, like, about resources, right? Financial, food, it's across, right? So I think that that's what we could do, and really don't forget about those kids that need it the most, right? And how can we really provide those supports because we know, like our teachers are saying, that we're connecting with some families more now. We're trying to reach out to them, to speak to them. So if we can help them to do that more with those that are being affected, like Latino families, how do we really provide those resources to help them deal with this crisis?
Thank you. Thank you all. And before I get to there's a lot of listener questions coming in. Since you've all sort of brought up your concerns, I know a lot of families are wondering, well, how do I know if there's a problem? Like, is there anything people should be looking out for in their children to know if something more concerning is going on? Any of you can take that if you have any.
I can jump in with a few suggestions. So some of the things, so it, of course, depends on the age of the child. But for our little ones, so as young as babies can show us the effects of stress on their development. And we can see that in terms of disruption in feeding or sleeping or being more fussy. With toddlers and little ones, sometimes we see developmental regression. So, you finally got them potty trained. It seemed like they were doing great. And then all of a sudden they're having accidents again. Or it seemed like they were doing great sleeping through the night. And then all of a sudden, it seems like they're struggling and waking up again. So we can see some developmental regression. Also, potentially with language and things like that. As kids get more into school age, I think that some of the signs that a child is really struggling with stress, and I will leave it to Dr. Aguilar Gaxiola to speak more on the mental health manifestations. But really, we do see some behavior, difficulty with impulse control, and sometimes we see trouble with, just regulating their behavior, just difficulty calming their bodies down. But for some kids, you won't see any of that. For some kids, they will have headaches or tummy aches, or they'll become more withdrawn. And I think especially with teenagers, you kind of have to, they can be more irritable or, more withdrawn. And so you kind of have to, a couple of the things are just, I suggest for parents to take a second to tune in, check in with your kids to see how they're doing. And for little ones, offer them suggestions of, how are you feeling? Are you feeling, are you sad that you couldn't go to the birthday party? And, giving an opportunity to express what's going on. But I think those are some of the things that I would suggest cueing in on.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to chime in, or?
Patricia, you want to go in, and I'll then comment.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, just to complement the excellent response of Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, I think that what is key here is of all the responses that that she mentioned, depending upon the age of the kid, which is very important because there are different stages of development that one needs to consider. It is important also to consider prevention and early identification and early intervention because you know, things can get complicated if those manifestations are not identified, you know, on time. And one of the things that I'm particularly concerned is that, and once again, it depends upon the age, but kids as early as 10 years of age, you know, that might already be thinking about is better not to exist. You know, I'm talking about suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Just to give you a sense, there is a remarkable report that it was reported by the national, by the CDC, and also by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. And what they provide is that in a 10-year period, this is a decade from 2008 to 2017, and if you consider the suicide rates, and these are individuals who committed suicide, that there was an almost 90% change and an increase in children and youth ages 0 to 17. So 10 years or later are really ages that we need to look at. There is a recent study that the National Institute of Health in which that they funded that shows that nearly 1/3 of youth ages 10 to 12 screen positive for suicide risk in emergency department settings. And, you know, and often they go to the emergency room for physical and not psychiatric concerns, and yet they are having these risks. One last thing that I want to mention, and this is very important to keep in mind, and that Patricia did a great job, you know, mentioning this, is that as you know, the COVID-19 ravages California and the nation, we have seen that the number of children infected is also rising, especially in both Latino and African-American kids. So they are testing positive at higher rates than other groups of children. Just to give you a sense, as of yesterday, Latino minors make up almost 72% of the cases where race and ethnicity is known, despite being only 48% of the state's population of kids. And that is, as of yesterday, once again, a little over 30,000. And this was a month ago, in July 12, it was less than 10,000. So, you know, Latino and African-American and other kids, they are not the only ones, but there is a disproportion on this that had been stricken by the virus, according to the data from the California Department of Public Health. One last thing very quickly, and I'm sorry if I'm coming across as too professorial. I cannot help it, you know, that's my profession. But something that should give us pause and really, you know, is a call to action is that the CDC reported recently that Hispanic and Black children in particular were much more likely to require hospitalization for COVID-19, with Latino kids 8 times as likely as white children to be hospitalized, while Black children were 5 times as likely. And this has a lot of implications that should give us pause in terms of how children of color may very understandably feel hopeless and angry and anxious, among a lot of other big emotions, when they see and hear things about these incredible challenges.
Thank you. Patricia, did you have any thoughts you want to add, or?
Yeah, just something I wanted to follow up about, talking about feelings with kids, even if they're little. I feel like, even with my own kids, I have a 8-year-old and a 10-year-old. And one day my daughter came in and she asked me, how do you feel about COVID? So, it was interesting to hear her, come to me and say that. And I, told her, and I was like, how do you feel? And then she started crying, and but she needed that space to share with me her feelings. And I think it's important for us to do that with kids, because even if they're little, like, they will have some form of way to connect with you and say, because there's a lot of fear, right? It's like, because their world changed 360, right? It's just like no friends, no school, probably many of them, their parents lost their job. I mean, so many things. And just giving that space to really talk about feelings and saying, explaining and talking about, it's okay that we don't know, it's okay to feel weird, and this is different, and maybe, we don't know what's going to happen. So I think that something that parents could do, and not force it, but if you see that something is not, you see your child is changing their behavior, it's something that you could do. You can use books, you can use, there's ways to do it, but I feel it's important for them to have that space to talk about what's happening. Yeah.
Jocelyn, I just wanted to add one more resource, just so that our listeners, our viewers, have something concrete that they feel like they can take away. My office created the Surgeon General's stress-busting playbook for kids and caregivers. It's available at covid19.ca.gov, and it has lots of great strategies as to how to approach talking to your kids about coronavirus, what they're stressed about, and what we can do in terms of helping ourselves feel a little better and have some stress-busting strategies. So if folks are looking for a resource to talk to their kids, definitely go to covid19.ca.gov, and there is an emotional well-being page, and you can go ahead and download the playbook.
Great.
And that, Jocelyn, if I can comment on that, that's a great resource, by the way. I've definitely encourage all the viewers to check it out, because I think that is very helpful. I'm a father and grandfather, have 4 adult children, and I have 5 grandchildren, ages 7 months to 11 years of age. And I'm constantly looking for resources that could be helpful also for my family. A couple of things that I want to mention. One is that it is important to think that it is not only the children, which of course, this is the focus of this conversation, that are affected but the parents as well. This goes both ways. And boy, I think that we need to understand that relationship in a way that when we talk about prevention and early intervention and identification, it is of critical importance to pay attention to that as well. My wife and I, who love dearly our grandchildren, of course, our children as well, that, our grandkids, the youngest is 7 months of age. We haven't been able to hug her for 5 months. And that breaks our heart, and that's the impact that we have on ourselves. The last thing that I want to mention is that, fortunately, most children and teenagers are resilient by nature. This, and you, Dr. Burke Harris, you have been a champion of resiliency. And we'd love to hear some comments from you, because we need to think about what are the protective factors, what protect our children and our families against a lot of the problems. And what I can tell you is that, and by the way, resiliency, there are different definitions, but it basically refers to our ability to persevere in the face of adversity and demonstrate the capacity to overcome with past, present, and future traumas and challenges. So, Dr. Burke-Harris, I would love to hear from you, because I saw a tweet that you sent of a talk that you gave in Scotland, in which there were 2,500 people waiting for you to make a presentation. And there is this video that I saw you, I was inspired by that. So would love to, and it was on resiliency. So would love to hear some of your thoughts about this.
Sure. I know we want to get to questions. So
yes.
For Jocelyn, do you prefer for me to answer, or?
Maybe you can sort of wrap your response to that into, because a lot of the questions people are bringing in is basically, how do I help my kids? So I'm sure that fostering resilience is going to, but I do want to, get to as many of these people who are listening as possible. And so, yeah, to the extent that you guys are, jump in if it feels like it's in your, your area, or pass if not, and that way we'll get to as many questions as we can, since there's a lot of people out there, dealing with all sorts of things that are very similar to kind of what you're describing.
Wow.
So a listener named Al asked, what can you do to help your depressed and self-secluded 11-year-old girl get out of this pandemic funk? Is anyone else experiencing this with their kids? I'm so sad. I think that there are a lot of people experiencing that with their kids. And I think if to the extent that you guys have ideas for listeners of, I think Patricia, you offered some about, the questions that you can ask, but if you don't mind expanding on that, and, if others of you have sort of specific concrete things that people should be doing, that would be great.
Yeah, so I'm happy to speak briefly in terms of, there are a couple pieces in speaking to the resilience piece. I think one, and some of the things that we describe in the Surgeon General's playbook, is that when we look at the science, some of the things that really help us to reduce stress hormones, reduce the effects that stress have on our body are sleep. So, going to bed and waking up at the same time. So having good sleep hygiene, like not having devices or watching TV 30 minutes before bed. Exercise, regular exercise, so important to help us burn up stress hormones and release healthy hormones in our bodies. Having good nutrition, even though it feels tempting to get to the bottom of that bag of Doritos right now, right? But really good nutrition helps our brains and bodies have the building blocks to make the healthy hormones that help to regulate our mood. Mindfulness, like meditation or mindfulness practices are helpful. And one of the things I think that's really important is that now is a great time to reach out to a mental health provider, right? Because, chalk it up to the pandemic. Sometimes, especially in communities of color, there can be stigma about reaching out to a mental health professional. And I think that that feels, especially for the listener who just wrote in really concerned about his daughter, if he's concerned that she really is experiencing depression, I definitely recommend reaching out to a mental health provider, because it makes a big difference. It's really important. And so I think those are some of the things. The last thing that I would say is that the number one ingredient for a healthy child, especially our little ones, is a healthy caregiver. right? So all of the things that I just talked about, sleep, exercise, nutrition, mindfulness, mental health, and healthy relationships, right? The healthy relationships is like the biggest ingredient. All of those things are just as important for us as they are for our kids. And so it's really important for us as caregivers to put our own oxygen masks on so that we can be available to be there for our kids.
Patricia, there's a reader, Camila, who asks, I have a 2-year-old who hasn't interacted with another toddler or hardly anyone outside of me and his dad since the pandemic began. He was already shy before. Am I right to worry this prolonged isolation will have a negative impact on his development and ability to socialize? Is it worth trying to form a quarantine pod so he can see kids his own age every now and then? Is there anything we can be doing to help him or compensate for the lack of interaction with peers? I know other parents of young children have written in. Do you have advice for the parents of little kids? Do you think these quarantine pods are a solution for those who feel comfortable doing them?
I think that, I mean, if the first thing is it's hard for everyone. And I think parents also have to think that they're doing the best they can, right? Because every solution has a risk, right? So it's not, that it's you should do a pod or you should do this or that. But I feel like for parents, if you have a 2-year-old, there are many things that you can, whatever you can do with him. So it's about the quality time that you spend together. So things that maybe follow what the 2-year-old likes to do, right? If he has a favorite, activity, and spend like that quality time with them. So make them feel like there's something that they're picking, there's something that they're enjoying, right? Because there's this pressure now that suddenly parents are pre-K teachers, right? And it's like, it's impossible. In addition to usually having a full-time job. So I think parents have to say, I'm doing my best. And it's more about the quality time than the number of hours that you're going to sit and spend with your child. So dinner time, there's always opportunities for learning, right? And yes, of course, like it's not the same, if you have an opportunity to be with other kids, but kids learn, adapt, and they will like get back to it right away, right? It's like that's the beauty of little kids, right? That maybe it will take a little time for him to adapt again, but they will catch up, right? They will remember how to make friends. And if your child is a little shy, well, it may take longer, but don't worry, they'll get there, because that's how nature is. And that's why we have to think about are we going to help parents to go back and give them guidance on what to expect, right? It's okay. It may take longer, but don't worry, because you worrying, the child will feel it too. That anxiety and that stress, it's worse than saying, okay, I need to, during my day, let's say my son loves stories. Why don't we spend like really good 20 minutes reading her favorite story, and then we can just do other things, or just try to pick like a few things, because no mom can spend all day being 100%. It's impossible. I mean, like it is just not possible to expect that. And that's, I think, what we're expecting from parents, being super parents, working, dealing with, being a teacher, and because they want the best for their child, right? But it's not real. So I think it's just more about this quality time. And if you see that there's a neighbor that that it might work, and you feel comfortable, and your child will feel comfortable too, then you can try it, right? As long as it's safe. But it doesn't mean if you don't do it that your child is going to be, behind, or they will come back. So I think I think that's the main message, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so then turning from young children to adolescents, a number of listeners are asking specifically about the impacts on adolescents right now. Ashanti asked Dr. Burke-Harris, would you consider the pandemic to be toxic stress for adolescents specifically? How do you advise parents to do, what do you advise parents to do to help mitigate those effects? And then Kelly said, many parents are returning to work, leaving teens at home unsupervised, making it easier for teens to engage in unhealthy behaviors. Do you guys have any insight for the parents of teenagers specifically?
Well, I will say, as in our household, we have a 4-year-old, an 8-year-old, and twin 17-year-olds. So I am feeling the parents' pain on the teenagers. And even if you are home, sometimes they're kind of off in their room, and you don't see them for a little bit. And so how can it, to the question of whether or not the pandemic represents toxic stress. And for me as a scientist, when we talk about toxic stress, we're really talking about the body's response to the stress. So when any of us experience a stressor, the way that our bodies respond to it can be positively, can be a positive stress response, what we call a tolerable stress response, or the toxic stress response, where it leads to harm to the developing brain and body. And really the difference between the tolerable stress response, where the body really goes back to normal, and the toxic stress response is that presence of safe, stable, and nurturing buffering relationships. And so I think one of the things that I really recommend is, again, checking in and tuning in with your kids, seeing how they're doing. And one of the pieces that I will do for my own personal self-care is really like it's like a stoplight. It's red, yellow, green, or maybe green, yellow, red. Green has to do with my self-care practices that I do when I'm feeling great, and for kids, just encouraging for them to get that exercise every day, regardless of whether if their team isn't practicing anymore or something, but even being able to go out and go for a bike ride or do something like that. And stay connected with their friends, right? Like those regular practices that we do when we're feeling okay. And then yellow is like, first of all, recognizing how do you know when you're in the yellow zone? Like, what does that look and feel like for you or for your child, right? And then having a plan as to what you do to help you step up your self-care regimen so that you can kind of move out of that space. And so for some, it's calling a therapist. For some, it's doubling down on their meditation, really being careful about their diet. All of those pieces can be part of it. And then the red zone is really kind of recognizing what that red zone is. If you have a child who's exhibiting, symptoms of real mental health concern, or you're worried that they're depressed, they're not getting out of bed, things like that, then you really, that's a time to go for help. And it's good to have a plan ahead of time as what to do if if you or someone in your family gets in the red zone. That makes it easier to be able to get the help that you need and move through it. So one resource I want to offer, the Department of Healthcare Services has something called the CalHope Warm Line. The number is 833-317-HOPE. And the idea with the warm line is don't wait until you get in the red zone. If you notice that you're in the yellow, go ahead and call that warm line. Again, 833-317-HOPE, so that you can get access to the resources that you need.
So Rose asked in follow-up to some of the comments, how do the parents, caregivers not transfer their anxiety to kids regarding their ability or inability to support the curricular work that is coming to the students over these digital virtual platforms? There's obviously a lot of pressure on parents right now. It's hard to not feel stressed. I can speak from personal experience. You want your kids to get the curriculum, you're also working, and so anyway, I would love for any of you to jump in on that. How do you keep from passing your stress along to your kids?
Can I take that one, Jocelyn?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think that we need to recognize, especially in families in which there are several members, in addition to the parents or one parent and some kids, some of them teenagers, about the impact that this is having on the teenagers, for example, in which they are not only challenged with, being at home and needed to do homework and needed to do chores. And often, especially in families that live in very close quarters and that the parents have to go and work, that sometimes a little bit older kids, teenagers, sometimes need to take care of their younger kids. And this is a lot to ask from the kids. And something about the parents, and this is not an easy situation for anyone, it's very, very challenging, is that we need to remember that parents and grandparents sometimes that are involved in the lives of the kids, that we tend to be models for the children, and how we handle this stressful situation can have an impact on how the children and youth manage their worries. So one message that I would like to send to the parents is to encourage them to be understanding, patient, and tolerant of differences in the kids and reactions. In terms of the parents, I think that it is so critically important to try to realize what's happening to them and to be open to their feelings. If they are feeling fearful, uncertain about the uncertainty, depressed, and depending upon how this is being presented, I think that the advice already given of reaching out either to resources like CalHope, but also to seek consultations, services from counselors or from other mental health professionals is very important. And also for the parents to recognize what are the triggers, that keep that level of being on edge or anxiety, how that is presented, and to try to reduce the stressors that they can possibly control. For example, looking at the news 24/7 with so many bad news, it can be unnerving. So taking a break on that, looking at their sleeping patterns and keep them as stable as possible, and being in touch, not to be isolated, being in touch with other family members, being in touch with friends. Now is the time to call the friend that you had 30 years ago and that you had such fond memories. So don't get isolated. That's a very, very important piece.
Thank you. So we have just a few more minutes. I'll see if we can get through another couple questions. One has to do with, I know earlier, Surgeon General, you mentioned the importance of reaching out for mental health care. But obviously there are some kids that it's just not working for to connect to them, to connect virtually. Christy had written, how are schools going to screen, identify, and counsel students who are anxious, stressed, and potentially unable to engage in virtual school? How will these children get services like psychological counseling? And I will wrap in a question from David. He's asking about children with IEP or 504 plans who maybe are having a harder time, getting some of their learning and mental health issues met virtually. So do you guys have any thoughts about all the many populations of kids that right now are not able to connect very well?
Well, I know that the state is looking at their guidance in terms of guidance for schools on how to support kids who have special needs, right? And so I know that folks are working on that. I think that one of the things that I just wanted to add to the conversation for a lot of folks is just that, especially for parents, like if it feels hard, it's because it's hard. It's a pandemic. It's a once in 100 years pandemic. So if it feels hard, that's appropriate. And I think that one of the things that we can also do is really just kind of relax, giving ourselves a little bit of grace, especially as we're trying to support our kids and figure out the technology and all of that kind of stuff. And then also give our kids a little bit of, breathing room and empathy. Yeah.
Great. And then Monica asks about what's going to happen when we go back to school. So what is all this teaching through screens? How's that going to impact our return to in-person non-screen teaching? Can you guys weigh in on what we should expect to happen with kids once they are able to return to their physical classrooms, or what some of the mental health impacts we're going to see, a year from now will be, and will things go right back to normal?
I think that we don't know, because it's all new for us, right? We never had this situation where we had to do distance learning. But I think that what we could start thinking is, how do we really support, the teachers, the caregivers, to be ready for the comeback, right? Or as much as we can, right? It's just like knowing that it may take longer for kids to start, the process, to be, sitting in a classroom. So I think that just starting to plan ahead and think about different scenarios of how would what are the different, and especially what we were talking, some kids will maybe had access to a lot of resources. A lot of them will not, right? So we talk about Latino kids of color in general. Also thinking about, okay, these kids are going to need a lot more support. How can we really prepare for that? And then, as much as we can, start thinking about, what are the expectations and how can we really prepare the people who are going to be in the classrooms and who are going to be caregivers to support them in this transition, and also parents, right? It's like, it's going to take time. And also, the more as much as you can, I think as a parent too, the less anxiety, right? It's at least, yes, we're all doing our best, and this is a pandemic. It's just, and sometimes you forget because you want the best for your kids, right? But sometimes you have to step back, and it's like, everybody's going through the same, right? It's like, we're gonna get out of it, and we're gonna make it. So I think that's my vision.
Thank you. So we've had some great questions from readers and a lot of great insight from all of you. So thank you. We just have a few minutes left. So I wanted to close with kind of a two-part question. One is, I want to give you the opportunity of, if you have any final thoughts about mental health of California kids and how to support them during this time. And then I personally am interested in what you're telling the kids in your lives to help get them through. I think, parents, we're all kind of looking for really concrete ways to make things a little bit better. So would welcome, your personal, what are you doing personally? I'd love to hear from all of you. So whoever wants to jump in first.
I'll be happy to jump in. One of the things that's been really important for us in our household to help our kids get through is really making meaning of the situation and empowering our kids to be part of the solution. And that's been both true as responding to the COVID pandemic, and also to the issues of racial justice that are, front and center right now, and helping them understand, for example, gosh, I know distance learning really stinks. My son hates distance learning. So I know distance learning really stinks, but you know what? You're staying at home. That's your way of protecting your teachers and other members of your community so that we can be part of fighting this virus. Right? And when my 4-year-old wears a mask, he's a coronavirus superhero, right? He's fighting the coronavirus. And so, when my kids, when we have these hard conversations and they paint their Black Lives Matter sign and put it in the window, helping them recognize that, yes, this is difficult, this is hard. And then also thinking about, okay, so what do we do when things are hard, right? How do we take care of ourselves? How do we take care of each other? How do we take care of our community? And how do we express our feelings? And then how are we part of the solution? And so that's really been the focus in our household, is really helping our kids understand that the things that are crummy, the things that they're not happy about right now, they're purposeful and they're towards a higher goal, which is helping and protecting our entire community.
Great. Dr. Aguilar Gaxiola, do you have any tips?
Well, I'm so, let me tell you, so happy and humble as well of having been chaired, this panel with both Nadine and Patricia. Just a few things, a few thoughts about this. And there is a good news and a bad news, I think. The bad news is that, unfortunately, I suspect, and there are other people who suspect that once this pandemic is over, what is going to linger for many years to come are the mental health impacts. And they're going to be presenting in different ways. And also, there's going to be a long-term consequences, physical consequences. The good news is that there are tools about early identification, prevention, and management of acute stress and anxiety that can prevent more serious problems. There are resources like CalHope, as well as many other resources that I would encourage to look into that. Those who need interventions should start early and maintain through time. Another last good news is that not all of the persons who would develop, as a result of what we are all experiencing, a mental disorder, not all persons will develop a mental disorder in spite of all of this trauma and all of these stressors that we are confronted. And part of the reason is because of resiliency as well. And I think that we ought to purposefully enhance that resiliency with, being caring for one another, being understanding with one another, manifest that we do care and have empathy for others as well, no matter what the setting and no matter who we are. I think that we need to focus much more on that aspect.
Thank you. Patricia?
Yeah, I think that I would just add is a few things. We're all together, like we're all experiencing this. This is gonna pass, hopefully. So there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And also, I think that for me, what I took from today is like, ask for help when you need it. Don't be afraid of that, because we're all humans, and it's okay to be feeling overwhelmed. I mean, it is a big thing. So don't think that you have to solve everything alone. There are resources, and we heard a lot of them today. And it is okay to reach out when it's a mental health issue. It is okay, because there are people who are professionals who can really help you. So I think that that's something that, people should, or if it's with your kids, or if it's with whatever, don't feel like you have to know all the answers, and there's help out there. And we're all together, and everybody's experiencing it. So don't feel like you're gonna not be successful or you're not doing a good job. It's just a very hard thing, and there are things out there that can help you deal with it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Burke-Harris, Dr. Aguilar-Gaxiola, and Patricia Lozano for being here today. I appreciate your insight, both as a journalist and as a parent. And thanks to all of you watching here for your great questions and participation. You made my job easy. I'll let Neil go ahead and wrap things up.
Thank you, Jocelyn. And thank you to our guests for spending time with us this afternoon. We advertised this as a session about kids, and we learned a lot about kids, but I think I'm taking away a lot of optimism and information about all of us, right? We're all in this together, and it was fascinating to be able to hear these three people share their thoughts with us. And Jocelyn, thanks to you for leading it. If you missed part of this discussion today or want to see it again or share it, we'll have the video on our website at calmatters.org and on our YouTube channel. You can also find all of our virus and pandemic coverage on our website. Our team has been working nonstop for 6 months on this story, harder than they've ever done. I'm really proud of what everybody in our newsroom is doing. I invite you to keep up with that work, follow it at calmatters.org, keep up with our next events as well. Sign up for our newsletter. That's where you'll get all the stories every day and know what events we're having. And if you can, again, we depend on your support to do this. We're a nonprofit. Donations are what make this possible. So if you can help us, we'd appreciate it. On behalf of our guests and all of us at CalMatters, thanks very much for coming. Stay strong and safe.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, let's see, there we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to say, of course, thank you very much